Welcome back to the Red Dice Diaries, and this is a viewer requested Matters of Fate video about advantage creating for beginners, and this was requested by Alice Vidrine via my channel on YouTube. And Alice says, I know you've already done all manner of Matters of Fate videos, but I've noticed that groups new to Fate, even ones that generally seem to get it, can have a serious kind of paralysis when it comes to create advantage actions. They understand how aspects the GM puts out their work and they can manage the fate point economy, but they never really seem to actively engage with the create advantage action, which could have saved my players a headache or two. If you've ever encountered this, I'd love to hear a Matters of Fate video about your approach. Well, I've not really had too many problems with the create advantage action myself, to be honest, Alice, but in my opinion, it is one of the most versatile and fun parts of the system. So thanks very much for your question and your video request. The reason I like it so much is because it ties the narrative and the system together, whilst allowing you to reinforce your character's core concept. But the whole idea of creating advantages can be a little difficult for some people to grasp initially. But before we get into how players can use create advantage, we first need to define exactly what it is. So when you boil down creating an advantage to its most basic, it means when your PC takes advantage of either an existing circumstance present in the scene, so an aspect that's already been described, or by creating an advantageous situation, adding a new aspect to a scene. But you might ask, well, can't I just spend a fate point and invoke an existing aspect? Well, of course you certainly can. However, if you don't have any fate points, or you just don't wish to spend them, you can still use create advantage to use an existing aspect, as long as you can describe how your character is taking advantage of it and make the appropriate roll. So, for example, if the GM tells you there's a floor covered in oil aspect on the scene, you could describe your character's attempt to trip and knock over an opponent because of the floor's slipperiness. The GM will ask you for a roll, and if you succeed, then you'll get some free invokes of the existing aspect. If there wasn't a suitable aspect on the scene, but the GM had, say, just described some barrels of oil that were standing nearby, you could describe your character perhaps knocking over one of these barrels to make the floor slippery. The GM may then ask you for a roll, and if you succeed, that aspect will be placed on the scene, and you may get some free invokes of it to use later on. So what's the point of advantages, and why doesn't the game just use invokes? Well, there are a few reasons to use create advantages. One is that you don't have any fate points, or you don't wish to spend them on invokes. 2, there isn't a suitable aspect currently on the scene. 3, you want to change a scene to make it more advantageous for your character or allies. And 4, it encourages teamwork, since you can allow your allies to make use of any free invokes that you accumulate, as long as it makes sense within the game fiction. For me, the last 2 reasons are what really make create advantage worthwhile. A GM might add some stuff into his description that doesn't warrant a specific aspect. The create advantage action gives you an opportunity to take a bit of scenic detail and make it into an aspect that you can use in a scene. Now, don't forget, you can also spend a fate point to add scene details, or often GMs will just allow a player to ask questions such as, is there a hay wagon parked outside the barn? And if it makes sense within the setting and within the game, they'll often just say yes, since it's adding a bit of detail to the scene. This is the real power of creating advantages. It gives the player the ability to add stuff into a scene and then take advantage of it, hence the name of the action, using the game mechanics. So if you're a beginner, how should you get into using the create advantage option? Well, if you're in a situation and you're describing an attack or an action in a cool way, then try and think about how you might use the environment around you to help in that action. For example, a thief trying to sneak past a noble's guard might attempt to use the darkness of the night to cover his passing. First of all, ask your GM if there is already an aspect for that, and if the GM has already said that the night is pitch black with a little moonlight, they may consider that an aspect. If not, then try and think of a way that your character can increase their chance of taking advantage of the environment. In our thief example, perhaps the player says that before he leaves his hideout, his character dons some black clothes and daubs mud onto his face to make himself less noticeable. He asks the GM if he can roll to create an advantage, perhaps something like concealed against the night or something similar, because of this. Once you've created your advantage and you've worked out how many free invokes you have, assuming your roll is successful, you can then return to your original action, sneaking past the guards or whatever, and make the roll using the free invokes to help you succeed. In our thief example, the player has created his concealed against the night advantage and has gained a free invoke. Unfortunately, when he attempts to sneak past the guards, he rolls 4 minuses, which is a terrible roll, so he uses the free invoke to re-roll it. If he'd got a slightly better roll, then he might have used the free invoke to give him a +2 instead. Of course, had our thief succeeded in the roll without requiring the free invoke, he could save it for later, or perhaps, assuming he described likewise camouflaging his allies during the create advantage roll, allow some of his fellow adventurers to use the free invokes, maybe the slightly less stealthy fighter or whatever. So we then move on to creating advantages and stunts, and this is another area where creating advantages shine. If you've been playing Fate for a little bit, one of the simplest ways you'll find to make a stunt is to have it give your player character a +2 bonus to a certain roll under a narrow set of circumstances. An easy example is, because I'm a world-class fencer, I get +2 to attack rolls when using a fencing sword. However, that's not a particularly interesting or versatile stunt. It does one thing and has a couple of very simple criteria to judge whether or not you get the bonus. In that example I've just given, the stunt only works if you're making an attack roll and your PC is equipped with a fencing sword. You can get a lot more versatility if you create a stunt that gives you a bonus to create advantage rolls. You just need to think about some way that your character is particularly adept at taking advantage of the scenery or situations. So for example, because I'm a world-class thief, I get a +2 to create advantage rolls when taking advantage of lighting conditions. Now this stunt can be used under far more circumstances. Basically, anytime you create an advantage where darkness or lighting conditions is a factor. And adding the +2 to the create advantage rolls means that you're far more likely to succeed with style and get 2 free invokes rather than 1 on your roll. Okay, so we've talked a bit about how the players can get into creating advantages. I just want to round off by talking about a couple of things that the GM can do to actively help and encourage this. Well, first of all, describe the scenery. Your players are far less likely to use the scenery to do cool stuff if they're not really sure what's around them. Some players are great at just asking or intuiting scenery based on descriptions and common sense. But if you find that your players aren't creating advantage using the scenery, then you might need to up your descriptive game a bit. You can also make it clearer to players what aspects are present in the scene. And the way I recommend you do this is take an index card, a piece of paper, a sticky note, whatever you fancy for each scene. Write in big black permanent marker 2 or 3 aspects that apply to the scene in nice big bold text so everyone can see it, and slap it down in the middle of the table when that scene's playing. This will reinforce your descriptions. It'll provide a useful visual reminder for yourself if you need to go back to that scene or make notes later. It also puts there in black and white what the obvious aspects are, so the players don't have to keep asking you. It's a time saver and they won't feel awkward or they won't be unsure about what they can use. And finally, have your NPCs create advantages and use them against the player characters. You can bet that if your NPCs start creating advantages to use against the PCs, and you take the time to explain how they've done that, then the players will soon start wanting their own advantages to counteract the smack that their enemies are bringing. So there we are. I hope that's answered some of your questions. Alice, thank you very much for the suggestion. And I hope anyone who's watching this and has enjoyed this video will consider clicking on the red dice up there to subscribe to my channel. As always, if you have any comments, put them in the comments box down below or hit me up in the Google Plus links. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Until I see you next time, take care and happy gaming.